Good morning. Our scripture reading today is Psalm 85. It is actually on page 473 in your red Bible, not 453. Justin.
My fault.
Oops.
This is the stuff. That's the stuff.
This is the stuff, right?
That's right, that's the stuff.
I'll read the odd numbers if you'll read the even, and together we'll read the last line. Lord, you were favorable in your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all their sin. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, so that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation. Let me hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people, to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. Surely his salvation is at hand for those who fear him, that his glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him, and will make a path for his steps.
This past week, I was able to pick up a book I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with. If you haven't read it, I'm pretty sure you are either, you probably heard about it or maybe even are in it. I started reading a book called Idle Banter this week to kind of give me some perspective on things that happen within the community that Lauren and I and Violet find ourselves in now. Reading that book, I was kind of nodding and laughing at some of the things I came across because in one of those, it made mention of small town, small rural life, and it was the idea that everybody's business is everybody's business. That something that happens within the town, everybody tends to find out about it pretty fast, and that sometimes I've since being here, I can confirm that a lot. Like you just kind of see the stories and people know things about you before sometimes you know them about you. And it's kind of wild to watch that play out. But it was sometimes things kind of slip through, even my radar. Some things kind of go through the gaps and I don't see things as fast. And it was one of those things that got mentioned last week at our Riverside service that piqued my interest, and it was the mention of during our announcements where someone said, I think it was Jan that said, even though I'm not going to be able to go on this trip I had planned, that we had to kind of pack our bags and our vehicles broke down and we got towed back, but she was very thankful in that moment because she said, I'm thankful to be here for this service, and I'm also thankful that I get to go watch this play at Zeno Farm. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't know what Zeno Farm was, so I kind of left. We went home that afternoon, and I got on, Master Google and started looking up what Zeno Farm was, and I was like, oh my goodness, this sounds amazing. Like I didn't know this was literally down the street from where we lived. I was like, I have to go check this place out. And so just on a whim, I was at the general store later that afternoon, and I made mention of it to someone, and I said, hey, I would really like to, what can you tell me about this place? And the person was like, I'll do you one better. I'll just call the people that are in charge and they'll give you a tour. And so on Wednesday, I found myself walking around Zeno Farm with Lauren and Violet, getting a tour and seeing how this beautiful place kind of came into being. And it was just this wonderful experience. And, even before going there, I really felt that I kind of knew what it was about, that, because I had a frame of reference to what I thought Zeno was going to be because of some classes that I took while I was in seminary. I took a course called Theology and Disability, and it was this whole idea of expanding one's theology to include those that are within our communities that have disabilities. And I was just exposed to all these different new concepts and these new writers. And one of those writers' names was Nancy Iceland, and she was a seminary professor down at Emory University for years who had several disabilities of her own. And she said this in one of her books: "A liberatory theology of disability is in solidarity with other liberation theologies, though it incorporates unique emphasis and perspectives, structures and attitudes that keep women and people of color and the poor marginalized, also stigmatize people with disabilities as their normal practice." You know, learning this, it kind of prompted me to become an advocate for those with disabilities and even take an independent study the following semester to research and present my findings to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which was the denomination I was part of back in North Carolina. I wanted to push for them to come up with an affirming statement like other Baptist denominations had, and our lack of that kind of showed that we needed to address it. Because I really kind of believe in this concept that if those in our communities can't come and worship with us on Sunday morning, if all can't worship, then we really can't call what we do on Sunday morning worship. And so I took all this stuff I packed in the car along with Lauren and Violet and Krista, who was the one that took us up there for the tour. We all got in the car, and I had all these preconceived notions. I had all these past experiences that were mostly based with my research and were heavily academically laden. I took them up Quaker Street to Zeno Farm, and I was given a different taste of what affirmation actually looked like. Instead of seeing able-bodied others as advocating on behalf of those with disabilities, I saw those with disabilities given the platform to advocate for themselves. And it was something powerfully beautiful. I left with the metaphorical, new set of lenses and realized that, like so many times before, and maybe I would dare say we, often bring our own ideas and thoughts and expectations to every experience we have. We have to kind of acknowledge that we can't get out of our own way sometimes, that just because we are bodied individuals, we can't remove ourselves from any situation. And because of that, we need to recognize it and appreciate our own experiences and the value that are in those and the uniqueness of them as well. We also need to do this while not allowing them to become the end-all, be-all of knowledge and understanding on any given subject, and that should include our own faith. Going through the Psalms this summer, we see the Psalter take us through a journey of faith, a journey filled with an array of paradoxical life circumstances that affect one's faith in such a way that oftentimes leaves our brain jumbled. In doing this, it combats our own experiences, our own certainties, the same certainties that can often get us into trouble if we let them by leaning and depending too heavily upon them. This tends to happen when our own spiritual walks, as we might begin to see God only existing in our circumstances. And when this happens, our vision narrows and we begin to miss God when God decides to show up in other ways. I think about this when I look at Scripture and see some of the biblical characters, and I started to ask myself this week, what if Moses had only looked for God in the burning bush? What if everything that happened after that, if it wasn't a burning bush, then it must not be from God, and so I can't listen to God's voice in any other circumstance? What if we did that? What if we looked for God in the burning bush and all the other stuff of the Spirit we just kind of cut off, because if Moses saw it in the burning bush and that's the way you're supposed to see it, then we can't see it any other way? Or what if, like the prophet Ezekiel, we look for God as having these many faces, as described not only the face of a man, but the face of an ox, an eagle, and a lion? What if that was the criteria? In order for something to come from God, it had to look and sound like that? Or what if, like the Apostle Peter, after the transfiguration, only wished to see Jesus like he did when the Son of Man was fully exposed in his glory? What if he only chose to see him in that moment where he was set in between Elijah and Moses, and that was all that he was able to focus on? He couldn't move on past that. Think of the things that Peter would have missed if that's the only way he could have viewed God. He would have missed all the parables. He would have missed all these lessons. He would have missed those one-on-one times. He probably wouldn't have missed the rebukes that he got a few times, but he would have missed all these moments, and he would have certainly missed the crucifixion and the resurrection. In Psalm 85 this morning, we see the author's voice run the gamut on how they've experienced God on several different levels. The psalm begins with reminiscing of God's favor involving the restoration of land and wealth to the people. The author writes of God's willingness to forgive the people for their wrongs and their withholdings from their understanding of God and his justification, this wrath that they thought that God was sending down upon them or would send down upon them. All of this is part of this inherited faith that they had received, of this inherited faith of things that might not have experienced themselves, but had been passed on to them by previous generations. We know this to be true as the psalmist begins to shift to more current circumstances, where at the time they were experiencing God, the psalmist writes as if God was distant, and all these struggles were coming against them and mounting. These circumstances appeared to make them believe that God was angry with them, and so they plea in an effort for God to hear their voice, and in doing so, they begin to hear the voice of God, one that represents peace. By the end of Psalm 85, the author is confirming the faithfulness and goodness of God, knowing their pleas are not falling upon absent ears, and seeing that when people turn to God, they realize that God has already turned to them out of love and affection that was always present, even when their own circumstances didn't allow them to see it that way. Seeing the psalmist walk with God, we should be encouraged in our own journeys to not allow single understandings or one-time perspectives to determine all encounters and experiences. If we allow this, if we fall prey to this, we end up with a very limited, I would even say boring reality, and with a single source of which we base our preconceived and one-sided wisdom on. We must be on guard not to shut off other perspectives. But this is hard. It takes effort. You see, recently I was talking to a young man, and we were kind of sharing about how we kind of came to that moment. He was telling me a little bit about his faith tradition and where he was from, and it was a really kind of cool exchange of stories. But as the story unfolded, he was kind of sharing it like another similar story that had happened where he had done this with somebody else, and he was telling them about the tradition that he came from, and he said, I come from this tradition. And he's like, what about you? And that person says, I don't hold to any of that. I'm just a Christian. And the guy, he kind of laughed when he told me this, but I could tell there was some, there was some worry with that. There was some, there was an aching that came along that kind of like what John was saying this morning, that sometimes our words, even unattended, may have different ramifications that we think. And so as me and this young man began to unpack that, he kind of laughed it off, but I could tell there was an ache there. And by the end of our conversation, he said, am I a Christian? And I was, of course, affirmed him very fast and said, absolutely. Your faith, your denominational background, it just flows in. It's like a small stream that feeds into a very big river. And that story is something that goes out, and that we need to hear your story. We need to hear your perspective. And even if that person didn't know at the time, they needed to hear your history because it's part of their history too. This young man's story, his encounter, should encourage us to be willing to experience God in ways we are not expecting. We see this so often in Scripture. It offers us these peeks into different authors and explaining how they see God from so many different perspectives and angles. For that is what Scripture does at its core. It relates and functions better when viewed as a collection of voices instead of an owner's manual trying in vain to regurgitate the different writings from kings and priests and scribes and slaves spanning over thousands of years into one singular and constricting voice. When read in the light of recognizing these diverse voices, we get the chance and the lenses to see God in so many different ways. While these views might often seem to contradict one another, it should be expected, since it's less about the subject and instead more telling of those who wrote about the subject. Hence, diversity should be expected and welcome when we talk about God today, and should not be limited to a single narrative that calls for no questions to be asked or no room for different perspectives. For if we practice our faith this way, if we read our Bibles this way, we would be reading the Bible that we want instead of the Bible that we have. If anything, the diverse stories and views of God in Scripture demonstrate and affirm that all views are needed to help cultivate one's own spiritual journey of living and reflecting in order to grow and change. I think our hope in this is, like most Psalms end with this idea of hope, Psalm 85 does the same, is that we should hope not to remain the same, that we don't want to be the same forever. Time just changes us. We were talking this morning about how our eyes change, and sometimes we need glasses and lenses. And I know from my own experience that when I read Scripture as a 10-year-old, when I went to Vacation Bible School and I heard those stories, they meant something different to me then than they do now. Things are supposed to change. We're supposed to get different ideas. God is supposed to get bigger. When I became a parent, all of those things began to change in how I looked at God as a parent. You know, I could experience that on one side of the coin as a child, but now I was reading it with a different set of lenses. As a parent, God didn't get smaller. God didn't change. Only I did. Things became bigger, and I became more appreciative. I think as people, as sitting in church, we should never have the same idea of God that we had 10 to 15 years ago. God should always continue to grow and get bigger within our lives. I experienced that this week going up to Zeno Farms. You know, I went up there and meeting those there, the people that work there and the people that come and visit and help rehearse and put on the play. It just filled me with this gratitude, and they gifted me with a new perspective. They gifted me with a new image of God. And it left me, like so many times when God crashes into my life, it left me on my backside looking up. As someone who tries to follow the teachings of Jesus and the life of Christ, I was offered through this experience this past week to see Jesus in a new way, to see Christ in a new way. Christ, from what we can tell from Scripture, was an able-bodied man, but he was also a disabled God, because God in the form of Christ was limited in this incarnate form. This speaks directly to the issue of Christ's divinity, which has been debated since the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Being able to see God this way, to see Christ this way, allowed me, perhaps for the first time, to see God in the face of those who have disabilities. And just like the prophet Isaiah, when he had the vision of the Lord in the temple and he hit the ground because he couldn't look at it, I often found myself looking down while I was at Zeno, because it was too hard to look at the holiness in the faces of those that I saw. Amen.